Welcome to another episode of the Leadership Enigma. We are still going great guns. Would you believe it? We have had over 1 million audio downloads this year, so we'll certainly be celebrating that. Also, please do check out the YouTube channel. There are over 350 videos for you to enjoy. And the curiosity continues. In a world that is always on, where we are always continuously connected, it is utterly chaotic. Let's be honest, today is as simple as it gets. I have a question that needs answering by someone far wiser than me. And that's how do we thrive in an always-on world without sacrificing our well-being. And so, indeed, I have the author of this book with me here in the studio, Regenerative Performance, and good friend Dr. James Hewitt. You need to listen to Dr. James. He's got some advice for all of us in a world that, let's be honest, has gone slightly mad. Come back to me just after this break. Hi, I'm Adam Pacifico, and welcome to the Leadership Enigma, a world-ranked, award-winning podcast that's insatiably curious as regards what leaders do, how they do it, and importantly, why. We'll delve into the human doing, but even deeper into the human being and the power of human-centered leadership to drive sustainable change. So whether you're an entrepreneur, business owner, corporate executive, each week we speak to global experts, academics, rising stars, ambitious upstarts and disruptors, as together we will discover that success leaves clues. James, it's a huge warm welcome to the Leadership Enigma. How are you?
I'm doing really well, thanks, Adam.
Thanks for coming in. I always ask, what do you think of the studio? It's your first time in the studio. What do you think?
Well, I feel very welcomed, and I think that's the most important thing. You've got a really great setup here.
Well, we're going to talk about human connection, aren't we? As opposed to so many things. James, you and I have known each other for a little bit, part of the Impact 11 community, so a little shout out to them. Just give us a little bit of a CV of how you have ended up doing this kind of work, and perhaps more importantly, why do you do what you do, James?
Well, the journey for me probably started with an obsession with anything that goes fast. And that was space rockets, racing cars, anything with wheels. And I found my way into the sport of road cycling, racing, when I was in my teens.
Right.
And something about the fact that you could hit speeds of 100 kilometers an hour on tyres a few centimeters thick caught my interest.
I'm nervous already.
Well, you've got the benefit being a teenager, haven't you, that your kind of perception of risk hasn't developed.
Unbreakable.
So you don't realise you can get injured and worse. So anyway, I found my way into that sport. And in my teens, in the early 2000s, I moved to the south of France to pursue that dream of becoming a professional cyclist.
Yep.
And had the opportunity to race full-time for several years, even won a few races. But it became clear that my cycling career was never going to reach the heights that I hoped for. So I cut my losses, went back to the UK, studied sports science, eventually set up a coaching business, which is what you do when you're a failed athlete, right? Not everybody, but that was my story. And eventually joined a human performance company in Switzerland, and soon found myself catapulted into working with high performers all over the world.
Right.
So Formula One drivers and teams, Fortune 500 companies. And to my surprise, I found that we had something in common. We were all living life at 1 million miles an hour. I was trying to succeed professionally, also be a good parent to our 2 sons. I was trying to be a good partner to my wife, pursue a PhD in my spare time. And on the surface, everything looked great.
Keep the plate spinning, James,
exactly.
Right?
But behind the scenes, I was pretty close to the limit.
Right.
There were far too many late nights, missed dinners, far too many flights. I was doing 100 flights a year or something at that point. And so this obsession started to emerge, an obsession with always on work and continuous connectivity, those 2 points that you mentioned in that introduction. And this question of how can we sustain high performance in the face of these demands without overcorrecting into disconnecting or burning out. And that then led to kind of work consulting, research, and really the conversation we're ending up having today.
Let's also mention you're doing now global keynotes as well, aren't you? This is a big subject for main events.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's so a lot of my work now, I'd say the majority of my work is actually speaking communication, sharing evidence-based tools, but perhaps more practical and inspirational ideas, which can help people to thrive in this always-on world.
So much to talk to you about, so kind of let's get into it, because I think we might be busting some myths as we go in this conversation. Let's kind of start with the first one. Wellbeing is a buzz phrase. I hear it all the time. I'm not sure people really understand what they mean when that word comes out of their mouths. Huge initiatives, but let's talk about I think you've called it the $70 billion paradox and why well-being investments, they just aren't working. So tell us a little bit about your view on that paradox.
So if you look globally,
Yep.
organisations worldwide are spending about $70 billion a year on what you might describe as wellness or well-being initiatives.
Yes.
So, subscriptions to meditation apps, yoga studios, nap pods, you name it. Yet 90% of employees say that their work lives are getting worse. So what is going wrong?
Yeah, there's your paradox, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm fascinated by that paradox and looking into what the reasons for that may be. And I think one of the fundamental challenges, one of the drivers of that paradox, is that people are probably looking at the wrong end of the equation. They're looking at the equation from an individualistic perspective. People need to yoga their way out of these challenges, as has been described by some of my colleagues in this space, rather than looking at some of the systemic drivers.
Okay.
And I think that comes from a misunderstanding about what well-being is. Because for me, well-being is not spending more on saunas, supplements, protocols.
That's a whole industry in itself.
Yeah, it's looking at some of these systemic drivers which lead to well-being as an outcome rather than as an input.
Okay.
And one of the ways you can think about this as a leader and in an organisation, there's an argument that the truest measure of employee well-being is discretionary effort. So how much effort does an employee exert beyond their job description? Because we've probably all seen this as leaders, as business people, that when people truly feel well, they're energized psychologically in terms of their emotional energy, their cognitive energy, their problem solving, their physical energy. They go the extra mile. And they do that in a way that's sustainable, that isn't going to lead them to burnout.
So can leaders at the moment, I love this point, if they are trying to assess or understand well-being in their workplace, just have a look at the discretionary effort or lack of that's currently in the system. Will that give them a little bit of a guide?
I think so, yeah, and that's not just my premise. That's not my idea solely. That's actually been described by some of the leading researchers in this well-being space.
So what are the biggest challenges, or what are we getting wrong as leaders with the best will in the world? What are we getting wrong again and again and again at the moment?
So I think one of the biggest issues that I see is that we all are facing pressures.
Yep.
You talked about that in the introduction. Always on work, continuous connectivity, getting pulled in multiple directions, working 60 hours a week, but still feeling like we don't have enough time to get our work done.
Time.
But unfortunately, there's been an overcorrection to that. And I think there's an overcorrection in two ways. On one hand, we've got leaders who are basically saying, well, this is all in our heads. We can just ignore it. Just push through. You mentioned it in other conversations we've had, pull your socks up, get on with it. They're ignoring that pressure. But then we've got an overcorrection in the other direction where people are saying, this pressure is inherently harmful. It's something that we need to avoid and perhaps be scared of. And, we need to wrap everyone in cotton wool. But neither of those responses really are appropriate. And they're certainly not going to lead to sustained high performance. And ideally, we want to find this third way that avoids those overcorrections and helps people to maintain both well-being and sustained high performance.
Let's deal with those three, because I think you've some of the labels that I'm taking from your research. Hustle culture. So tell me a little bit about what's hustle culture. Is that the kind of like, come on, just push through it, pull your socks up,
exactly,
stiff upper lip, and away we go? What's the problem with it?
Well, hustle culture ignores the fact that humans are not machines.
Right.
That we've all got a limit.
We may one be.
Yeah.
One day we might be. James.
Exactly. And, we've got it's this false premise that stress, that pressure, that overload can be ignored and that purely by force of will we can overcome it. Now, we all know there's exceptions. And I think one of the challenges with this is that there are these very rare people who seem to be able to persist and sustain huge amounts of effort long term. It looks like they can cope with short sleep, which we can talk about that perhaps in more detail, and it doesn't affect them. And they assume that that's the case for everyone. But the problem is that that's not the case. Actually, a lot of these people are deceiving themselves. They're not really the superhumans they might think they are. And even if they are, certainly the people on their team won't be.
Right.
But leaders have this cascading influence for good.
The role modelling piece,
bad,
which we're going to come
exactly,
on to, right?
Yeah, on their teams. You see, for example, that every hour that a leader spends working after hours generates 20 minutes of additional work for each of their direct reports.
Oh, wow.
Now
just say that again for us, so people might be listening or watching this thinking, hang on. That's so every hour.
Yes. That a leader spends working after hours, and generally in the literature that would be described as a cut-off as about 5 or 6 p.m., something like that, generates 20 minutes of extra work for all of their direct reports.
Wow.
So you can just see that's one example of this cascading impact. Now, there's a time for after-hours work, but the challenge is when that after-hours work becomes the norm, rather than the exception.
Okay.
And leaders need to recognize that their approach to what we describe as boundary management might not be the natural way of working for their teams. And that's just one example of that cascading
So
impact.
that's kind of the hustle culture, which is at one end of the extreme. And then we talked about, and a lot of press was on quiet quitting. And we heard a lot about this towards the back end and beyond of the pandemic. What's this quiet quitting all around about?
So there's an argument that quiet quitting is just disengagement rebranded.
Right.
But really, you probably define it as people's response to this pressure, this always-on work.
Yeah.
And they're saying, you know what, I'm going to do the minimum that my job description requires and nothing more. So an abandonment of any discretionary effort. And, you know, there's an argument that says, well, why should you do more than your job description requires? And I get it. But the challenge is if that is taken to an extreme, people end up feeling disconnected and actually enjoying life and work less. Because there's something to be said for the effort that we put into work, the meaning that we might get out of it. And you end up seeing people who are basically just getting through their days, counting down the hours, and a huge proportion of their life, because let's face it, we spend most of our waking hours at work, start to become less meaningful.
Okay. So what's that third, perhaps elusive category?
Yeah, the third way. How do we avoid these extremes of quiet quitting or hustle culture? Well, my view is that there is a third way, but it needs to avoid these extremes. And it recognises that both of these responses are sometimes well-intentioned responses to the pressures that we all face, with bits of truth in them. But the problem is that they're over-applied, and perhaps more importantly, people look at it as a default way of being rather than phases that we maybe need to dip into and dip out of, depending on the demands that we're facing. So, for example, there is a time to hustle. There's going to be a time to push hard. No one's really achieved anything of any value without a considerable amount of effort.
Yes.
The problem is if that becomes your default mode of operation.
Right.
There's also a time to step back, to disconnect, to leave work at 4 p.m. and go and sit in the park with some friends or whatever it is that you want to do. The problem is when we adopt those approaches all the time, the third way recognises that there's a time to push and being clear about when that push is, and then also being clear about when it's time to
this is all
back
about
off and
balance.
relax. Well, I'd argue that it's not necessarily about balance, because balance sometimes leads us into believing that it's possible to achieve this state of perfect equilibrium.
Right.
Whereas actually what I'm talking about is more dynamic.
So it's flexing.
It's flexing. It's more about boundaries than it is about balance.
Oh, I see what you mean. So it's not actually here's a balance point. This is what we mean. It's actually the ability to go between one and the other, traverse between one and the other at different stages depending on what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and it's about recognising boundary conditions. And by that I mean, you know, what is the upper and lower limit that's tolerable right now, and maybe over time. You know, this is the classic challenge that you see in this kind of wellness, well-being space, is that people create this idea that it's possible to have this, you know, perfect morning routine, for example, or you know,
the 4 a.m. club.
Yeah, exactly, or a perfect protocol, or you know, the ideal diet.
Is it all nonsense?
Well, I think the problem with all of these,
some things work for some people.
Again, there's some truth in it, but the over-expression of it or the over-dependence on it is problematic, because all of these protocols, these routines, rarely encounter reality. And well, they rarely are maintained when they encounter reality. Right. So if you think about, you know, the perfect morning routine, well, that all works well until you have kids or you get a puppy, you know, and the perfect workout.
Life gets in the way.
Yeah, and that's all fine until you end up in a hotel gym that's only got, you know, one functional piece of equipment. So we need to take this slightly more flexible approach that says, you know, what's acceptable and what's possible given what I'm facing right now.
Yeah.
You know, what's perfect, and then maybe say, you know, what range am I able to tolerate and still achieve my goals?
Let me ask you this question. It might be slightly unfair, actually. What on earth, then, do you say work-life balance is? Does it exist? Is it a thing? Or is it just one of those constructs that means different things to different people?
Yeah, well, I'm not entirely opposed to the idea, because I get what people are saying. What they're trying to say is that we want a mix between work and life that hopefully enables us to fulfill certain roles, expectations in our personal and professional lives.
This flex again.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think my problem with it is that it does sometimes lead to a kind of perfectionism that's unattainable. And so I prefer this idea of this dynamic range, recognising that there's going to be times where you over-index on work, perhaps at the expense of your personal life, and vice versa.
Okay.
But ideally, over time, if you look at kind of a 6 or 12-month period, you've paid due attention to these different domains. I think it's also important to recognise that people's preference for the integration of work and life varies. So there's a construct called work-life segmentation preference.
Right.
And it describes how we each have a different preference for keeping work and life separate or integrated. So at one end of the spectrum, you've got people who are strong work-life segmenters. So it's almost like oil and water. they're never
Never
really
the
going
two
to,
shall
they're
mix.
never going to mix.
Right.
And then you've got people who are much stronger integrators. They're very happy with this kind of blend of work and home life. And you see people who, this is the person who gets home from work and might have dinner with their family or, maybe with some friends. And then at the end of the day, they're quite happy to open their laptop again and do a bit of work. And actually, they might find that even helps them relax to put some ideas to bed. You've got other people, the segmenters, who can't think of anything worse than having to do some work in their home life. The important thing is that we adopt what's called boundary management strategies that fit with that preference. And it's actually the violation of those preferences that seems to cause a lot of problems. And what you'll see in terms of the overcorrection again is that you'll have a CEO, for example, who's very comfortable with integration, who then assumes that their whole team should also be equally comfortable with integration. At the same time, you might have a CEO who is really rigid and has got this this routine about segmentation and switching off at 5 p.m, who then doesn't account for the fact that some of their team probably prefer integration. And sometimes this concept can provide a shared vocabulary that helps to surface.
Is this possibly the excuse me? Is this possibly the answer to another phrase I hear all the time? Is flexible working? Organisations are trying to work out what does flexible working, and it's obviously very individual. Is the answer somewhere here for that? How people?
Yeah, I think it is somewhere there. So flexible working, hybrid working. One of the challenges is that we do have all these new ways of working now.
Yeah.
And a lot of it's been facilitated by technology. There was a time where it was impossible to take much work home beyond the papers you could fit in a briefcase.
Yeah.
Whereas now we can work anywhere, anytime. So there's definitely something in this concept of hybrid working, flexible working. I think the challenge is that very often our approaches to work aren't organised. And if you take hybrid working specifically, there's a guy called Nick Bloom, who's an academic in the US, and he's done a lot of brilliant research in this space.
Right.
He leads something called the WFH Institute. You can look that up online and find some of his data. But his contention is that hybrid work really works if it's well organised. And that means there's clear expectations about, for example, when people need to be in the office, when they should work from home, and perhaps most critically, why. The problem with this flexible working is that if it isn't well organised, people don't really know why they're expected to be in the office, at home, what time they should come in or not. It just creates chaos. And often, perhaps most problematically for leaders, mismatched expectations. The leader assumes that flexible working means you need to be in for this and out for that, but that's never articulated clearly. And it can lead to tension and misunderstandings ultimately.
I'm going to jump around slightly because you've nudged me, I think, in the direction of change. And you look at the psychology of sustainable change. Everyone talks to me about how do we help our leaders lead through change, lead through uncertainty. It's a hot topic. Maybe it's a buzz phrase right now. Talk to me a little bit about the psychology of sustainable change from an individual perspective to an organisational perspective. What are you seeing in that category?
So I think when we're talking about change, I think you're right to look at it both individually and organisationally.
Yeah.
But one of the ways I think about it, so my background is as a human performance scientist. I'm interested in how people perform under pressure. And experiencing change is a really clear example of something that generates pressure. The challenge is, some people are much more comfortable and excited by it than others.
Yes.
A lot of that often comes down to our beliefs about stress and pressure fundamentally.
Right.
Because when you experience change, there's a level of uncertainty that generates stress. Some people are going to inherently believe that stress is probably going to be something positive.
Some people struggle almost with grief, don't they? Of grief of losing the old way of doing something with a new way.
Yeah. And some of that is because it's comfortable, isn't it? But some people actively seek out some of that discomfort.
Yes.
And are motivated by it. And some people fear it. And I'd argue that a lot of this does come down to our beliefs about stress and pressure. Is this change going to be something that's going to inherently help us to grow? Or is this going to be something that might harm me? And so if you look at those very fundamental beliefs, that is then going to influence people's appraisal. So how do they perceive what's going on around them, which is then going to influence their responses and ultimately influence their behaviour in that change context. So if we take the first step, we look at beliefs. If you believe that stress is something that can lead to growth, then when you see change occurring around you, you're probably going to say, well, this isn't a threat. This is actually something that can lead to growth. And you're much more likely to say, I've got the resources that it takes. That's called secondary appraisal. I've got what it takes to be able to thrive through this.
Okay.
That's then going to lead to a more adaptive stress response. So you can even measure this in terms of your physiology with things like heart rate variability. You can look at people's hormonal response, their brain activity even. which is then going to influence their behaviour. They're much more likely to express the best of themselves. So, for example, if you've got someone who is inherently very curious,
Yes.
that's one of their strengths. If they're perceiving stress as something that's going to lead to growth, they've got this adaptive response, they're going to be open, they're going to be curious, they're going to learn new things that are going to help them to navigate this change process. The flip side is if you've got someone who believes that stress is inherently harmful, in that appraisal phase, they're going to say, this is a threat. Maybe you haven't got what it takes. You're going to get a less adaptive stress response, much higher levels of cortisol, perhaps to an unhelpful degree. You'll see things like lower heart rate variability, brain activity, which means that then when they encounter change, if they're a very curious person, rather than expressing that curiosity helpfully, they might under-express it. They kind of just shut down.
It's almost like fight or flight syndrome.
Exactly, and that's the stress response. Right. That's exactly that stress response. Or they're going to just distract themselves. They'll go and learn about everything but the thing that they need to navigate that change in a healthy way.
I can't see it.
Exactly.
So what does a leader or an organisation need to be thinking about when they want to go through a significant change? And many organisations are having to pivot or be agile just because of the ecosystem that they're finding themselves in right now. So any leader at the moment thinking we need to change as an organisation, I'm oversimplifying this, James, but where should they start to look or think?
Yeah. Well, I'd be thinking about, is there a good match between the resources people actually have and they think they have and the demands that are being made of them?
Yep.
And do people feel a level of control in that situation? Because the data are really, really clear that our perception of our ability to control the situation or have an influence on what's going on around us is actually one of the top predictors of whether we're going to respond healthily to stress. So there was this great paper published. It's got a really nice, pithy title. It was called "This Job is Literally Killing Me."
Right.
You can look it up. And basically, they did a longitudinal study. They looked at a group of people and how they responded to stress. But in particular, they were looking at the relationship between demands and control. So the demands people were facing and their perception of control. If people experience very high demands and they had a low experience of control, they felt like everything's happening around them, no ability to influence it.
Or to them, right?
Their health, exactly. Their health got a lot worse, and it actually predicted some really negative health outcomes, cardiovascular events even. However, people could be experiencing the same level of demands. If they had an adequate or high sense of control, then not only was their health maintained, it actually improved under pressure. So my counsel to leaders who are going through a change management process, who are
forever changing.
Yeah, exactly. It's just an inevitability now. It's to say, look at your team's resources. Do people feel energized? Do they feel like they've got what it takes?
Yeah.
And that relates to that belief and that perception. But then, how are you enabling people to experience a degree of control in the midst of that change? Now, obviously, control can be overexpressed in unhelpful ways, but it's about having a sense of what's going on, what they can do in relation to this process. Because if that sense of control drops, that's where you'll start to see people fail to perform under pressure in a healthy way.
So that should be a paramount focus for any leader or leadership team thinking about an element of change within the organisation. I mean, can people change? I mean, on a personal level, how easy is it for someone to change? We talk about behaviour change, habit change. Can we do it?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. I mean, the interesting thing is about this performance under pressure topic specifically, particularly in relation to our response to stress, our beliefs can change remarkably quickly. So there is a researcher called Alia Crum, and she's done a lot of research into how beliefs affect our responses across a really wide range of areas. And she's done some fascinating research in nutrition, incidentally. And this isn't just a little curious, you talk about curiosity.
I like a bit of curiosity.
A little curious aside here, but she's demonstrated how our perceptions of whether a drink contains a lot of calories or few calories actually influences the hormones which regulate appetite. So our mere perception of what is in what we're eating or drinking affects our physiological response. Wow. But she's also looked at this in relation to stress specifically, and this relates to your question about how quickly can beliefs change, can we change? Yeah, she demonstrated that exposing people to even short videos that suggest that stress isn't inherently harmful, it's actually something that can be managed, it's something that we can grow through, change people's beliefs in a matter of minutes. And that change in belief actually resulted in a change in their physiological response to stress. So in some instances, we can change very, very quickly. In other contexts and instances, it takes a bit longer.
Still highlights, isn't it, that we are, as humans, deeply complex and individual as opposed to machines. Something else we'll come back to. I just want to link this to the whole working from home, working at work. It's still something that is going on for so many of my clients. And we were chatting earlier over a coffee, and I wanted you to talk about, You mentioned to me the under 35s. Just share that statistic with me, because I think this is quite fascinating in itself. The under 35s, what is their biggest fear at the moment?
Yeah, so, and this is some data from a couple of years ago now, but it indicates that long-term remote working is generating a great fear of loneliness among the under 35s. And it kind of makes sense because, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we spend most of our waking hours at work.
Yes.
And if suddenly most of those waking hours are spent sitting in front of a screen on kind of, Zoom calls or Teams calls or whatever, then you are losing a huge amount of social connection. And there is this fear associated with long-term remote working that people are going to feel lonely. And I think many people are noticing that.
I mean, some people say they love the hybrid digital nomads, for instance. I mean, so is it again horses for courses? Some people love it, or again, do we not really understand this yet? We're still trying to work it out. Some people talk about going back to the office. Is there an element of surveillance and lack of trust, or is it about productivity, or is it about, to your point, it's about human connection?
I mean, there's definitely going to be differences. So one of the most enduring personality models, basically is called OCEAN, that's the acronym you can use: openness to experience, conscientiousness, agreeableness, extroversion, and neuroticism.
I'm very impressed you can remember all of that straight off the bat as well, James.
But if you look at extroversion specifically, you're going to find a spectrum.
Yeah.
And so you're going to get extreme extroverts who just want to be surrounded by people all the time, who feel like they get a lot of their energy from being around people. Then other people are going to score much lower on extroversion, more towards introversion. And if you've got someone who's naturally more introverted, they may find that kind of open office environment, being surrounded by people, maybe overwhelming. And actually working from home, having a smaller group of friends that they can have deeper relationships with on their terms might fit them perfectly. But the bottom line is, regardless of where you are in your personality on those 5 factors and extroversion, introversion, social connection is a fundamental human need.
Right.
So I'm a fan of psychology. I've studied it as part of my PhD research. There's some models in psychology which are enduring. And the reason they're enduring, they've stuck around, is because they're predictive. So there's a lot of ideas in psychology, but for me, they need to stick around and they need to predict something useful for me to really think they're worth paying attention to.
Okay.
That OCEAN model, those 5 factors of personality, is one. The other one is called self-determination theory. It's one of the most enduring models in human well-being, actually, and it contends that humans really have 3 fundamental human needs.
Go on.
Autonomy, competence, and relatedness, or that sense of connection. So autonomy, ability to deploy our time and energy in a way that's aligned with what we want to do, our values. Competence, we feel able to actually enact our will, we feel able to do our job, for example. And then relatedness, that sense of connection with each other. And you can see that if those factors are fulfilled, it's much more likely to lead to well-being, to thriving, maybe even to sustained performance. The problem with remote working is that there is a possibility that sense of connection can be compromised, particularly if you're not getting it in other places. We don't need to get all of our sense of connection, relatedness from work, but it is an important part of it. And unfortunately, I think remote work has compromised that. The flip side of this is that if we just tell people to come back to the office without telling them why, this goes
just
back
for the sake
to
of it.
my well-organised hybrid model,
Yes.
that can end up undermining some of those other human needs. So, for example, autonomy. So if you feel that going back to the office is all about people just keeping an eye on you, that really undermines autonomy.
Right.
So you don't feel you can deploy your time and energy in the way that you feel that you want to, that is aligned with your values. You're being forced to do that because someone is watching you and telling you to. And that's going to create its own series of problems, whereas other people would feel working from home provides that sense of autonomy.
So if you're a leadership team and you've got thousands, maybe tens of thousands, I've had leaders sat where you're sat, hundreds of thousands of people as part of their organisation. Where on earth do you start?
Well, I'd start by looking at, are some of these fundamental needs being fulfilled? Where are people beginning in terms of their well-being, for example? We might call well-being as an outcome. And there's ways that you can measure that. So there's a really simple survey, which is open source. It was developed by the WHO. It's called the WHO5. And it measures well-being in several factors. It's a really short survey and gives you a combined well-being scale.
Okay.
And it will be from 0 to 100. And it's been validated cross-culturally. There's translated into different languages. And it will give you a score from 0 to 100. And if your score as an individual is 50 or below,
yes,
you kind of that will predict negative outcomes in terms of your health and well-being. So again, it's predictive. So I think it's got some value there. a really simple thing to do would be to deploy a survey like that, and at least then you've got a sense of where people are at, both in terms of the global score, but then you can also start to look at maybe whether those individual factors, things like vitality, things like engagement, are high or low. You can also take it one step further and do some cohort analysis. It's interesting, I've talked to quite a few organisations who do these large-scale wellbeing surveys.
Yes.
And for some reason, not many people seem to be doing what's called cohort analysis. They might look at, for example, what is the average overall in the organisation, what is the average in departments.
So do you mean actually pulling people together?
But they actually look at groups, groups that share characteristics. So, for example, you might find a group that was super high in engagement, but really low on recovery.
Right.
And you might say that group is a group that's worth looking at, because if that recovery isn't addressed, in the future you're probably going to see that engagement start to drop off. And there's various different statistical methods that you can use to do this, and things like elbow method, k-means clustering. You don't need to worry about that. But essentially what you might end up with is kind of spider charts which show these kind of archetypes. Okay. Where you might have what you call the strugglers, who are very low in energy, very low in recovery, very low in engagement. You might have the thrivers, who've got a lot of energy, they're recovering well, they're really engaged. And then you've probably got a kind of surviving group in the middle who are doing okay, reasonable engagement, but maybe a bit low in energy, a bit low in recovery. And so you can start to see what your organisation looks like, and then maybe target interventions. But perhaps more importantly, before you look at interventions, try and identify the systemic predictors of what's going on.
Get some data. Just say again, you said there were some open source tools that people could get hold of. Just say that again. So
called the WHO5. It's just a really simple survey tool, which you can Google it and you can find those 5 questions.
If you let me have the link of that, I'll put it into the show notes as well. Let's deal with the issue of role modeling, something that I talk about quite passionately, and you talk about this being a leadership well-being imperative. I actually heard the word leadership well-being. Was it well-being leadership? That term was actually leveled at me a number of months ago, and I hadn't heard it before, but it starts at the top, doesn't it? Tell us a little bit about that thinking.
So, I heard this phrase years ago. I think it was probably John Maxwell who said it, one of the kind of the grandfathers of this leadership space in many ways. And he said, leaders reproduce who they are. And I think we've all seen that in organisations, that if you see a really dominant characteristic in an organisation, it's probably something which is exhibited by the leader. And it's just flown. It's
Do you
flowed
think that's done deliberately, or almost just
sometimes? I think it is
unconsciously in many ways.
I think most of it's probably unconscious.
Right.
And some of it relates to those factors that I shared earlier. Around how after hours work has an impact on other people's work. But I think it might go a bit deeper than that. But there's a really interesting piece of research that was published recently. It's come out of Singapore, where they looked at hundreds of factors, over 200 factors, and with a particular focus on predictors, again, of organisational well-being and organisational performance. And so looking at this at a group level, do you know what the number one predictor of organisational well-being was?
You've got to tell me.
It was the leader's personal well-being. And the number 3 predictor of organisational performance was the leader's personal well-being. So
this really does heighten, the topic that I talk about is the power of the role of the role model.
Absolutely.
You are seen, you are heard, and you are copied.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Absolutely. And I'll give you an example of this. So there's a researcher called Christopher Barnes. He's another researcher that's definitely worth looking at. He's done some fantastic research looking specifically at the influence of leaders' sleep on various aspects of well-being and performance within organisations. So one of the studies that he did highlighted that if leaders' sleep is restricted to 5 hours versus 7 hours per night, they're rated as less inspirational by their team. And the mechanism for this seems to be that leaders engage in something called surface acting when they haven't slept adequately. And we can talk more about adequate sleep specifically if you'd like to.
I start to worry about myself in that one.
But anyway, for the purposes of describing the findings of this study, people were rated as less inspirational as leaders because they were surface acting. Essentially, they were communicating in a way that seemed to be less authentic.
Right. You talk about the authenticity gap. Is this right?
Yeah, it relates to this versus what's called deep acting, where you express yourself, you communicate more authentically. And we're very sensitive to this as human beings. So you might say, well, that's a shame. As a leader, I'm not as inspirational, but does it really matter? Well, there's a related piece of research that was conducted by Bain that found that an inspired employee is 225% more productive than an employee who's merely satisfied with their job. So we know that inspiration is this force multiplier for leaders. And if leaders aren't looking after their own sleep, you can see how it's starting to have this cascading impact. And that's just one example of that.
And what do we mean when we say inspired in the role, inspired in the job, as opposed to just merely motivated, excited?
Yeah. Well, I think an inspired leader has a greater ability to help people feel aligned with what they're doing. Perhaps seeing the link between their values and the impact that they're trying to have in their role, or what
Purpose,
their organisation is trying to do.
The greater good.
Yeah. So inspiration has almost got this infectious quality. It's almost, I'd almost argue that it's kind of a superpower for leaders, because it goes beyond just direction. It's the difference between, so what is leadership? Well, essentially, leadership at its most fundamental level is taking someone from one place to another.
Yeah.
And that could be physical, it could be metaphorical. But if we're able to do that in a way that means that people are sprinting with us from that place, we're going to make a bigger impact in the world. And for me, that's the difference between inspiration is people running with you rather than kind of plodding along behind.
So I have a whole section where I talk about the role of the role model. What is your critical message to why and how that is important for leaders?
Well, I think it would go back to that point that leaders reproduce who they are. So who are you? How are you living? How are you working? What effect is that having implicitly on the people that you're leading? Because they're not just watching you, they're being affected by you, whether you realise it or not. That sleep and inspiration link is just one of those examples. But there's also links between leaders' abilities to detach. We know that engagement's really critical. It's critical for people at all levels in an organisation.
Yeah.
But I'd argue that it's as important that we can switch off and get a sense of mental distance. Now, there was another interesting study published recently which described how when leaders were able to experience a sense of mental distance in their free time, they were actually more likely to lead in a way that was better aligned with their kind of leadership style. They were essentially more effective leaders because they were able to switch off the day before. So I think one of the biggest challenges we see for leaders, but perhaps for people at all levels of organisations, particularly in knowledge work, is we've kind of lost that ability to switch on when we need to, even though most of us are quite good at that. Perhaps more importantly, switch off when we want to.
See, when I listen to you, I do wonder whether work-life balance is a nonsense, because it's just life. How do we live our life, and how much awareness do we give to the impact that we have on others? That's what this is about, James.
Yeah, it's too integrated now, and I think that even though
that's the point.
We might have
mushy.
preferences for segmentation and integration. I'm not denying the fact we should have a level of segmentation. I think you don't want to be working in your sleep. We want boundaries, but really it's about having this dynamic approach to looking at this mix between work and life, and finding a mix that not only works for you but also works for you over time and is prepared to change over time. Because nothing is static. We've got to be able to adapt to the changing demands.
Well, James, this is why you have the PhD. I think you said integrated, and I said mushy. So that sums it up completely, doesn't it? Let me deal with another block of this conversation, and that's turning pressure into performance. I want to talk to you about the topic of resilience. Again, I hear this all the time. How do we become more resilient? How do we be resilient leaders? How do we have a resilient organisation, a resilient workforce? And so on and so forth. Talk to me a little bit about the biology of resilience. Some headline points.
Well, before we do that, I want to tackle what resilience is and what it isn't, and maybe how we can move beyond it. Because
go for it. What is it?
I've got a bit of a,
what is it?
I've got a bit of a bugbear about it. Well, I think sometimes the best way to think about this might be through a metaphor. Resilience is on the spectrum, but at one end of the spectrum, we've got fragility. You can imagine fragility like a tea candle. So imagine you take one of these little candles, you place it onto a table in your garden, and then a breeze blows across the garden. The flame is blown out. That's fragility. Now, one step up from fragility, we might call something resilience. And resilience is like placing that tea candle back on the table after it's blown out, taking a match and relighting it. And every time the wind blows across and the flame blows out, you relight it. That's resilience. You're bouncing back to the same level as you were before. We can move one level beyond resilience. We can become robust. That's like taking that tea candle, relighting it, and this time place it inside a storm lantern. And that storm lantern is going to protect that flame from the wind.
Right.
The challenge is that it's not going to change. It goes back to your point about change. Ideally, we want to go one level beyond being robust, so we can actually benefit from that wind. And in this metaphor, we're actually setting aside the tea candle. We're actually going to build a fire pit.
Right.
If you think about what happens when you build a fire pit and you ignite it, if that gentle breeze blows across the garden, it's actually going to bring oxygen
Yes.
to that fire, increasing the intensity of the flame so it starts to bring warmth to that entire garden. So when we're thinking about resilience, I'd like us actually just to think about it as one segment of this spectrum and actually start to ask the question, how can we move beyond resilience to robustness and ideally to antifragility, to create this state where the pressures, the stresses of life, it's not just something that we resist or bounce back from, it's something that we might actually grow through.
So are we making a mistake in trying to work out how we become resilient leaders? Because that's actually not what we should be aiming for. We should be aiming for being robust or even anti-fragile leaders. Have we got it wrong?
Yeah, I'd argue that it's perhaps
Love it.
Too optimistic. I don't know, it might even be idealistic, but I do think it is possible. But what it requires is us to look at what are the characteristics of anti-fragile leaders. And I'd say that we could probably think about it in three different ways.
Yep.
What is an anti-fragile body? What is an anti-fragile brain? And then how does that manifest in anti-fragile behaviour, both at an individual and a team level?
Right.
And so if I was working with a leader or a group of leaders or executives, I'd often look at anti-fragility in the context of those three different categories. So I'd say, what do you need so that your body can become anti-fragile, so that the stress that you experience might become something that you grow through rather than diminishes you or you just bounce back from. In terms of your brain, this is your brain at a physiological level, but also at a psychological level. This relates to, again, our beliefs about stress, for example. And then behaviour, we might be looking at topics like psychological safety, for example.
Of course.
Framing failure as an opportunity to learn, creating environments where people are happy, they're able to have those difficult conversations. I think one of the biggest misnomers or mischaracterizations of psychological safety is that it's niceness. But actually it's quite the opposite. It's about creating environments where we can have those difficult conversations, and that's much more likely to be able to foster growth. I've had the privilege to work in Formula One over the years, and there's a great quote from Toto Wolff, who's the team principal of the Mercedes-AMG Petronas team. And he talks about failure. He talks about some of the challenges of that environment. The average failure rate in a research and development cycle in Formula One is about 97%.
Oh, really?
There's a huge amount of failure. But he talks about the fact that when they experience a failure or a problem, they don't isolate the person, they isolate the problem. So they adopt this kind of learn it all rather than a know-it-all culture. Right. That's something that Satya Nadella at Microsoft talks about.
We see this in the airline industry as well, when there is a
absolutely
sometimes catastrophic. Isolate the issue, not the people within the issue. Is that
exactly.
Okay.
And so Toto talks about being ruthless about identifying the source of the problem, but not isolating the person in that. Which Satya talks about, this kind of learn it all rather than know it all culture, this kind of openness, this curiosity.
Yes.
And so for me, that's the basis for an anti-fragile culture. Again, like we throw buzzwords around all the time, don't we? And for me, culture or organizational culture is the way we do things around here. And so if you talk about psychological safety, high performance, anti-fragility in the context of team culture, that's about having human level conversations.
Right.
It's about fostering an environment where people can get beyond the buzzwords, get beyond the process even, and talk to each other at a human level.
Is this about, are we back to human connection again?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. And that's one of the reasons I mentioned that I'm a big fan of self-determination theory, is that there's so many aspects of human thriving and performance you can distill, you can reduce to, have we got a sense of autonomy, competence, and relatedness, that sense of connection. And if you fulfill those, you're really on a path to creating the sustained performance that I think many of us would hope to achieve.
Listen, James, we have had a bit of a whistle-stop tour on just a few elements that are contained in your new book, which is just coming out, or it's certainly due to come out. Well, by the time this episode is out, it's out.
Yeah,
you
exactly.
can get this as I'm holding it up to whatever camera I need to. How do people get a copy?
So it's available from good bookstores. Obviously, Amazon is probably the easiest place for many people to get it, as well as Barnes & Noble in the States. And you'll find it there if you do a quick search.
Is this your first book?
It's my second one, actually.
Your second book?
Yeah.
And I have a signed copy here, just FYI, which is always nice. How do people get in touch with you for you to continue the conversation with them, or for them to get you involved in some of the things that they are grappling with?
Well, I'd really welcome that opportunity, and whether that was speaking or just to have a chat and dig into some of these questions. And my website, drjameshewitt.com, is my home base, where you can find more blogs, ideas about this, as well as contacting me directly. I'm also very active on LinkedIn, so you can Google me there and find me on LinkedIn pretty easily.
I'll put all of this in the show notes, James, so it's easily found. Final question to you: in all that you've done, you've studied, you've experienced, and you're continuing to achieve, what is the best piece of leadership advice that you've ever given or received that is front of mind for you at the moment?
I know it's repetition. Sometimes we need repetition. It is that leaders reproduce who they are. If there's something that you want to see in the team that you're leading, ask the question: can you see it in yourself first? And I'd say the data bears that out.
And can you actually ask that question of your team if you're not quite sure if that's happening, or whether you're being deliberate enough with it? What would be a good and courageous question or series of questions to ask your team?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think it's about perspective taking, isn't it? And some of that we can pose those questions to ourselves. But if you were going to ask your team, I'd say I'd ask about strengths and weaknesses. I know this is a bit slightly larger topic, but I'd actually get people to do something called the character strengths inventory.
Right. So
this is a great framework which describes a group of character strengths, which are enduring characteristics which we all have, and ask everyone on the team to do that, get the leaders to do it, and then ask the question: when am I over or underusing my strengths?
Right.
Or how am I over or underusing my strengths?
Yeah.
And that provides a real shared vocabulary that as a team you can talk through and probably identify times where maybe you're miscalibrating those, which is probably having an impact on other people's ability to use their strengths optimally as well.
It's that self-awareness piece again, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And it all comes almost full circle to this is all energy expensive. If you really want to get this right, then you've got to lean into it. James, thank you so much for coming into the studio and having a fast and furious conversation with me. Regenerative Performance available now in all good bookstores, including Amazon. Listen, thank you so much. We may have to have you back and unpack some more of this as well. But great. Good luck with that particular launch, and I no doubt we'll see you very, very soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Join us again next week for more curiosity and insight with the Leadership Enigma. We'd love to hear your comments on today's show, as well as suggestions for future topics and guests. Get in touch with me on LinkedIn or visit us at www.leadersenigma.com. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe on all your major podcast platforms and on our dedicated YouTube channel. Thanks again for joining the community.